Most of us experience them regularly, if not frequently. Often it's a pleasant experience where we get to meet old friends and perhaps even visit pleasant places, maybe even spectacular places. Though normally we don't remember nocturnal experiences for very long. Sometimes these peculiar experiences are horrible, absolutely terrifying even. And I would think, in light of the temperature through the hours of last night, that many here engaged this very experience last evening. To what am I referring? Well, to dreams, of course. I read this week that during a typical lifespan, it's estimated that a person spends a total of about 6 years dreaming. They're suggesting that you dream on average 2 hours every night. See, maybe that just proves the point that we do forget most of what we dream. So how they found that figure out, I don't really know. But nevertheless, that's what I read. But those dreams that are in the category of horrible, we call night, don't we? A study released just this last week, actually, in the UK, found that women suffer with nightmares more than men. Now, typically, nightmares are bad dreams which cause a strong, unpleasant emotional response, such as or horror. In language for the children, that these are the scary dreams that even you boys and girls may have from time to time. And it's in those dreams that perhaps we find ourselves in a situation of real danger. Maybe we're being chased by someone or chased by, or we have the sensation of pain, or we feel like we're falling, and we just keep falling. Well, the passage that we come to this morning records a crisis that unfolded when the most powerful man in the then world had a nightmare. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, is of course that particular man. And his particular nightmare created a crisis for him. But it wasn't just for him. It was a crisis for his whole court. And it was also a crisis for Daniel, the man that we're currently studying. Well, how did Nebuchadnezzar handle that crisis? We find that in this passage. How did Daniel handle this crisis? We saw in our last study 2 Lord's Days ago that when the pressures began to build for Daniel to give in and to sit at the king's banqueting table, that Daniel refused. He stood for his God. Remember, as a young man, as a teenager, he stood early. He would not compromise what he knew to be right before his God. There's a sense in which that was a real crisis at that time. But that young man there in chapter 1 that we've previously studied, those physical temptations that were before him were screaming out at him. But Daniel refused to compromise. But now in chapter 2, another crisis comes into his young. It's possibly only been a year or 2 since chapter 1. And here he is. He's possibly still in training. Maybe now toward the end of his training in the Babylon University, as we called it. And a crisis hits him. How did he handle this one? We saw how he handled the last one in chapter 1. How does he handle this one? Friends, when a crisis comes into your life, how do you handle it? Maybe it's not to the extent as Daniel's and these dramatics, but perhaps it's just the mounting pressures due to the changing situation in your life. How do you handle that? Or maybe it's the unexpected event that comes out of nowhere and it's just thrust right in front of you. How do you handle it? Well, I believe we see in Daniel chapter 2, young man Daniel displayed wonderful courage in the face of his crisis. So I want you to consider with me this morning what I've entitled Courageous in a Crisis. And I hope to open up this first section of Daniel chapter 2 under stress. And the 3 things that we'll look at all start with the letter C. I'm trying my best to keep your attention this morning. Everything's working against me. But the 3 things will be the crisis, which is where we'll spend the most time. Then we'll look at the cry. And then we'll consider the conclusion. Think with me then. I encourage you to think. The crisis. What's the crisis? Well, the crisis came into a context. Let's think of that whole context. Everything at this point, at the start of chapter 2, before verse 1 commences, if you like, everything in Babylon is going smoothly. Nebuchadnezzar has conquered all of his enemies. He's ruling over this massive Babylonian empire, the world superpower back then. Babylon's enjoying a season of unparalleled prosperity and peace. A couple of years earlier, Nebuchadnezzar's troops had brought to Babylon the cream of young Judah. And those young men, along with others from other nations, no doubt, were in training. And they were being trained to become a new generation of brilliant Babylonian intellectuals, philosophers, and leaders. The bulk of those men ate sumptuously at table. But Daniel and his 3 friends were still eating parsley and lettuce. Remember, their diet of salad and veggies. And here they are engaged in their diet. All the others are faring sumptuously at the king's table. God is purring along smoothly. But Daniel chapter 2 records this crisis. And in the first place, think with me of the king's court in a crisis. Stated for us bluntly in verse 1. Halfway through the verse, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. As the citizens of Babylon perhaps enjoyed their night's sleep in a time of prosperity and peace, what most did not know was that the king was in torment, what seems to be a recurring dream. We're told we dream most of our dreams once. Though there are many who experience recurring dreams, the same dream perhaps dreamt on a number of times at different occasions or different nights. Research has revealed that up to 70% of females and 65% of males report recurrent dreams. Well, Nebuchadnezzar's in the 65% of males. It seems that this dream or this nightmare kept back, and I suggest that because verse 1 says Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. It's referred to again in verse 2, partway through the end, he calls those men in wants them to tell the king his dreams. The end of verse 1 tells us his response to this reoccurring nightmare. It says his spirit was troubled, so troubled that his sleep left him. He was haunted by this vivid dream. He couldn't get it out of his mind. In other words, this was one of those dreams that he didn't forget. We have dreams we do. This is one of those he couldn't forget. And so much was it haunting him, the Hebrew word here used, troubled, in his spirit, has the idea that he was moved. His spirit was agitated. I tried to think, well, how can we describe that for our help, for the children to understand? Well, you have a washing machine at home, don't you? Of course you do. For some sort, most of you probably have an automatic washing machine. But what does the automatic washing machine do when the clothes are inside? Well, we can accurately say it agitates them. It moves them from side to side, back to forth. It churns it all around underneath that lid while it's various cycles, especially the spin cycle. Well, Nebuchadnezzar was going through a spin cycle in his mind. His spirit was agitated. He was so troubled he couldn't settle down. Not only did he toss to and fro on his bed, which is what's told to us here, the word means troubled. He tossed hither and thither inside or internally. So here is Nebuchadnezzar. He's experiencing great internal turmoil. That's what's being described for us. This was a real crisis. It's robbed him of his precious sleep. we would call this today, he's suffering deprivation. That's what we would call it today. He can't sleep. It's a crisis for him. And what did he do? Well, he calls out for help. He seeks assistance. He doesn't go to the pill cupboard to find his sleeping tablet. That's not his means of addressing this. He goes for help. He doesn't call on God. He calls on the men of the world. Look at verse 2. Then the king gave the command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans, to tell the king his dreams. So they came and stood before him. Those men, that list of the great men of the earth, they were the wise men in Babylon, the philosophers of that age. They were the men who had much learning in sacred writings and literature. Some of those men looked to the stars for their knowledge and their guidance. Some of them were involved in occult practices. It's mentioned at the end. They're the ones that stand out. They're the ones who especially had distinguished themselves as the wisest of the wise. They were the pick of the bunch, if you were, as it were, that Nebuchadnezzar especially would want to know from. And Nebuchadnezzar summons all the classes of priests and these men skilled in wisdom and knowledge. They might work together to bring all their various expertise together, that they might be able to advise him, that they might be able to provide for him in his crisis the answer. Let's follow the story in verse 3. The king said to them, I've had a dream. My spirit's anxious to know, to understand this dream. And the king then, see, there's the spokesman. The Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will give the interpretation. You know, perhaps these guys have been there before. I mean, this is not really a difficult task. You just tell me the dream, and I'll tell you what it means. Maybe you heard this. I remember some years ago hearing Talkback radio program, ABC in Brisbane. You'd ring up, oh I didn't do this, people would ring up, tell their dreams, and this so-called expert would respond in the radio station and give her interpretation to what your dream meant. Well, wasn't that easy? Could make it up. And here's these men, they're coming, just tell us the dream and we'll give you the interpretation. We can explain it. Well, the king's wiser than that. Verse 5, the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be in pieces, and your house shall be made an ash heap. Nice chap, isn't he? Well, they had the reputation. They were not slow to chop people, to lose their heads and so on. That's the way they were. Verse 7, they answered again and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will give the interpretation. The king answered and said, know for certain that you would gain time, because you see that my decision is firm. The king could see right through these men. They were stalling for time. They were feeling the heat of the moment. They were beginning to feel the edge of that sword starting to cut into their body, and they were trying to work out a plan of how to get around this sticky situation that they were in. You see, it wasn't just the king who was in crisis. The king's court is in crisis. Carry on in verse 9, he says, if you do not make known the dream to me, there is only one decree. You're going to get the chop. Literally. Carries on in verse 10. Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore no king, lord or ruler has ever asked such a thing of any magician, astrologer or Chaldean. Nebuchadnezzar, reasonable. No one else has ever done this. No one else would ever dream of doing this, what you're putting in front of us. No one. Verse 11. Here's their admission. It is a difficult or a very rare thing that the king requests. And there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods. Oh, king, live forever. But you've asked us to do what is impossible for man. Now, those men, that list that comes to us there in verse 2, they no doubt had great knowledge. No doubt themselves had fulfilled their training and gone on and done their master's degree and their PhD, maybe 4 times over in our language today. They were men of great knowledge. But when it came to the real test, they were shown to be bankrupt. Yes, they may have had brilliant intellects. They could theorize and they could pontificate, but when put to the test, they fell short. They did not have the answer in their worldly wisdom. This story reminds me of another story that I've heard, and maybe some of you have heard this story. It's a story that's told about a meeting that took place, apparently, many years ago at the University of Chicago at the Divinity School, where an annual day of lectures was made, and it was open to the public, and people were invited to come, and they'd bring their packed lunch, and they'd sit and they'd eat on the nice grass, and that's where they would have their lunch, as it were, between listening to theologians. One year, the Divinity School invited Dr. Paul Tillich to speak. Tillich, in many respects, was a brilliant man. He had a great intellect. He lectured that day on the resurrection of Christ, giving his restitution theory. That's the resurrection, he would say, took place in the ecstatic experience of the disciples. And it was something that happened in the disciples' mind prior to Peter's confession, and certainly probably not something that belonged to the time after the death of Christ. And Tillich also told them that the resurrection of the body was as a symbol expressing the truth of essentialization. And that heaven and hell, well, they were to be taken seriously, but not literally. The lecture was long. It went for about 2 hours, so I think you're okay this morning. And the lecture came with a very strong German accent. At the end of the lecture, there was a question time. And an old African-American preacher rose to his feet. And he said, "Dr. Tillich, I got a question." The congregation turned around and looked at him. And this old black man with white hair slowly lifted an apple out of his lunch bag and took a bite. And there was an embarrassing pause, and then he said, "Dr. Tillich, my question is very simple." Munches away on his apple. "I don't know much about essentialization, nor about this restitution theory," as he's still crunching away. "I don't speak a word of German. All I want to know is this. This apple that I'm eating," and he's still chewing, "is it bitter or is it sweet?" Now, in an exemplary scholarly fashion, Dr. Tillich replied courteously, "I cannot possibly answer that question, for I haven't tasted your apple." The white teacher dropped the remains of the apple into his lunch bag, and he looked at Dr. Tillich and he said calmly, "Neither have you tasted my Jesus." The 1,000 in attendance erupted in applause and cheers. Dr. Tillich thanked the audience and promptly left the platform. Paul Tillich was a brilliant man. But all his theories and pontification could not help him pass the simple but real test. Despite all of his great knowledge, he was shown to be bankrupt. You see, he too, like the wise men of Babylon, didn't have the answer in their worldly wisdom. When put to the test, worldly wisdom always pulls up short. And all the might and wisdom of Babylon, on that particular day recorded for us here in Daniel chapter 2, all the wisdom and might and knowledge of Babylon was shown to be bankrupt. Bankrupt through and through. In the hour of crisis, what did Nebuchadnezzar do? He went to the men of this world, and the so-called wise men were useless. You know, I've been thinking through that this week, friends, and it seems to me that it's right on this point that this passage has something penetrating to say to the events that are unfolding in our world in these very days. This last week saw the inauguration of the new American president. And with his appointment, has come fresh hope. Of optimism has swept across the globe. President Obama is the man. Obama, surrounded by all of his advisors, his hand-picked wise men, will be able to solve the racial tensions at home, dissolve political military difficulties abroad. The message that's coming across the media seems, at least to my ears and my eyes, is in the hour of crisis, Obama and his men are our hope. Some of the other leaders of the world, listen to what they've said. The French president said this, I quote, "We are eager for him," speaking of Obama, "we are eager for him to get to work so that with him we can change the world." Arrogance. You know, you probably heard it. Our own Prime Minister on Wednesday, just gone, said these words, "Barack Obama truly is the hope of our time," end quote. Nebuchadnezzar says, "Send for my men. Surround the brightest and the best minds." And politicians are still asking and calling for the same thing today. Send for my men, the economists, the military strategists, my advisors. Surround me with the brightest and the best men of the day. Sounds pretty much to me like Nebuchadnezzar's demand. And what did he find? Well, it's like he said to those men, let the experts print out what's going to happen. Let them print out from their computers. Let them print out what should be done. And they press the print button on their Babylonian keyboards, only to find that the ink has run out on their printers because they had nothing to say. The whole academic community was at wit's end. The government was in crisis. And all the might and wisdom of Babylon, and could not we also say Washington, London, and even perhaps Canberra, is shown in men to be absolutely bankrupt. What's the lesson here? Well, I believe the lesson is very simple, and that lesson is summarized for us in the words of 2 Psalms. Please turn with me in your Bibles to the book of Psalm. Firstly to Psalm 146. If you remember, that was the psalm we sang at the outset of our service. And Psalm 146 says in verse 3, it's a pretty clear directive. Do not put your trust in princes, nor do not put your trust in of man or in humans or in other people in whom there is no help. It's a tendency for all of us to do this, even in the context of churches, friends. Don't put your hope in your elders. Trust in man. It's the direction. Now turn over to Psalm number 60. Right near the end of that chapter in verse 11. Hear the cry. Give help from trouble. Why? For the help of man is useless. Through God, we will do valiantly, for it is He who shall tread down our enemies. No, Mr. Rudd. President Obama is not the hope of our time. No man is. God alone is our hope. Whatever be the crisis, be it economic, be it relational, be it what it is, God is our hope, not man. God says to us very clearly about that in those Psalms, and I believe that's a lesson coming through in Daniel chapter 2. And if He could, I would say, that Nebuchadnezzar, if he could come back, do not put your hope, do not put your trust in man. I tried that once, and I failed miserably. Coming back to the story, the crisis, the king's court back in Daniel chapter 2, we read in verse 12. For this reason, because these men in their worldly wisdom came up short and they said, we can't. For this reason, the king was angry and very furious. Now that wouldn't have been a pretty sight. Remember who he is. He's the most powerful man in the world and he's in a rage. He's going red. Steam's coming out the nostrils, out the ears. He's about to explode. And he gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went out and they began killing the wise men. You see, court is in a crisis. The decree went forth. The soldiers were dispatched. The swords were drawn. And the heads began to roll, literally. The king's court in a crisis. But the second aspect of this crisis has to do with our character Daniel. And the second thing is Daniel caught in a crisis. Again, we're back in verse 13. So the decree went out and they began killing the wise men and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Well, we don't know where Daniel is, but they have to go looking for him. They track him down somewhere. Maybe he's down at the local markets doing his shopping. We don't know. But Nebuchadnezzar's soldiers, they're armed and they're ready to fulfill the king's decree. They've been dispatched. Their swords are drawn to obey the orders from the monarch. He's the most powerful man in the world. They wouldn't dare resist that command. And this command is ready to be put into place when it comes to this lad from Judah. It seems from the story that Daniel at this point wasn't even aware of being unfolding in the palace. But when the captain of the guard comes to him, the one who's overseeing the killing of the wise men, as it said in verse 14, it says then in verse 15, he answered and said to Arioch, this is Daniel, why is the decree from the king so urgent? Or it's this idea of harsh. Then Arioch made the decision known to Daniel. Somehow Daniel finds himself caught in this crisis. It's like he's an innocent victim, swept along in this thing. What should he do? Well, if your neighbour came to your door tomorrow morning and he held a gun to your head and he said, tell me the dream that I had last night or else. That's an equivalent to this. What would you do? Panic? Probably like me, go, well, geez, and fall in a heap on the floor. I'll just pass out. Or maybe you would have the presence of mind to bolt out the back door and you just hightail out of there. But what did Daniel do? When he got caught in a crisis, he displayed wisdom and courage. Look at verse 14, that's the language. Then with counsel and wisdom, Daniel answered Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had come out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He spoke with wisdom. In a sense, that's not natural, is it? When you've got a gun at your head, to speak with wisdom. It's a crisis situation, it's life and death. Oh, God's grace was on this man. He spoke with wisdom. But there's also great courage here, because who was it that he spoke to? Arioch. He's the man in charge of killing the wise men. He spoke to him. And we see his courage even more so in verse 16, where it says, so Daniel went in and asked the king to give him time that he might tell the king the interpretation. What courage he must have taken for this youth. He's a young man. He's going before the king. On any given day, that would be a frightening thing. The last description, the previous scene of what the king was like in verse 12, remember? Steam coming out of his nose, out of his ears, he's about to explode, he's in a fit of rage. King, that's the king, and Daniel goes to him at this time? Courage. Courageous in a crisis. Verse 16 makes it very plain that Daniel asked the king to give him time. Now, what did he want time for? It's actually a fascinating contrast, because the king perceived that's what the other men were stalling for, but he was not tolerant, but God inclines his heart here. Well, why does Daniel want time? We know why they want. Perhaps we could contest what was behind their desire. What's behind Daniel's desire for time? Is he wanting to go and get together all the other wise men and call together some political summit? Does he want to have a talk fest on how we're going to overcome this crisis together and let's pool our wisdom? Is that what he wants? Is it also a matter, or maybe it's, if you're the one that would hightail out the back door, maybe he wants to sit down and let's come up with a plan of escape. How can we get out the back door of the city of Babylon and escape back to Judah where it's safe? Well, no, it's none of those things. He stalls for time for a wonderful reason. Which brings us to the second thing this morning, the cry. We find that in verse 17 and 18. Daniel went to his house and made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they might seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this city, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Where did Daniel go, according to 17? He went home. He went home to his three friends so that they could lay the matter out before God in prayer. You see what's happening here in verse 17, and especially there in verse 18, is that Daniel is sharing the problem with his friends, with these other young men, and they come together to pray. Verse 18, if you want to give it a title, is United Prayer. They had a prayer meeting. That was their primary focus in gathering in Daniel's house. To have an understanding. They prayed intelligently. He shared with them what was happening. It seems that they didn't know either. He lays it before them, and then they all lay it before God. Cry out to the God of heaven. The young men, remember, potentially when fear could have been gripping their heart, Daniel takes the lead. And Daniel turned to God in the crisis. Daniel found friends with whom... You see, Daniel had picked his friends carefully. Friends that he could pray with. Remember, they're teenagers probably still. But even as young men, he found friends that he could... Young people, that is a wonderful thing for you to imitate. Choose friends with whom you can pray with. The tendency is to choose friends who you can play with. And there's nothing wrong with your friends. But choose friends who you can pray with. Not just ones who like the same things, who have the same interests. It's okay that you would go that way, that's natural. But true friends pray together. And they haven't got to be 40, 50, 60. These are teenagers. So as you start, some of you children, school, some of you are going to a new school this week. As you start college or university in the coming weeks, you have a fresh opportunity to choose your friends. Look for friends who you can pray with. That's what Daniel did. At a time of great crisis, these young people were not overrun with fear. They prayed to the God of heaven. You see the contrast, friends. In the hour of crisis, Nebuchadnezzar wisdom of this world. But Daniel went to the wisdom above. And it was in the place of prayer that God's mind was made known to Daniel. Seems to be implied there. He's praying with his friends in verse 18. Now notice 19. Then, the context, just prayer. Then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. A night vision. And perhaps it was that Daniel was asleep. God did give the vision in a night. Maybe it was even during a dream. Remember Nebuchadnezzar at the start of the chapter? He couldn't sleep in the grip of his crisis. But it seems Daniel could. Because Daniel trusted him. Daniel waited upon the sovereign Lord. Daniel could rest in the night even though the threat of death could knock on his front door in the morning. In the midst of his crisis, Daniel believed in a sovereign God. Not just believed in him, he trusted in the sovereign God, and therefore he prayed to the sovereign God. It's not just about a set of things that you believe, it shows in action. Daniel waited upon the sovereign Lord in crisis, and amazingly, it was an uncertain time, wasn't it? Are not some of you in seasons in your lives where it's uncertain? Think of how uncertain it was for Daniel. That's when he prayed. In the face of the crisis, Nebuchadnezzar's cry was for the wise men of the world. Daniel's cry was to the God of all wisdom. That's the cry. Now we finish with the conclusion. What's the conclusion? Well, the first thing that Daniel does when God gives him the dream is mentioned at the end of verse 19. What is it? What's the first thing he does when he gives him the dream? So Daniel blessed the God of heaven. He praises God. And then he goes on to describe this God. Verse 20. For wisdom and might are yours or are his. He changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. Wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. Daniel is acknowledging that God is the sovereign Lord of the universe. It's you, Lord, that have established Nebuchadnezzar and put him on his throne in Babylon. And it's you, Lord, time that you will remove Nebuchadnezzar from his throne and put someone else there. That's relevant to these days. It's the sovereign Lord who raised up an Obama. 12 months ago, it's the sovereign Lord who raised up a Kevin Rudd to be made their respective countries. Your sovereign Lord, though, not them. Now, in our story, after he praises and acknowledges God's character, he goes back to Arioch and he says to Arioch, you need to stop the executions. We've got the very thing that the king wants. I've got the dream. And I've got the interpretation. And the captain of the guard goes to the king, and I want you to look at verse 25 and listen to what the captain of the guard, Arioch, says. I have man of the captives of Judah. Really? Was that true? I have found Daniel. Is that what happened? No, that's not what happened. Verse 24 says, Daniel with Arioch. Arioch didn't find Daniel. Daniel found Arioch. And yet here is Arioch, the captain of the guard. He wants to take the credit. And that stands out in amazing contrast to Daniel when he speaks with the king. Look at verse 27. Daniel answered in the king and said, the secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, astrologers and magicians and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king. But, that's man, but there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets. Verse 30, now listen to the humility of this man. But as for me, this secret has not been revealed to me because I have more wisdom than anyone living. But for our sakes who make known the interpretation to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your heart. You see the contrast. Arioch wants to take the credit before the king. But Daniel, all the credit to the one to whom it's due, to God. Daniel is saying, oh king, I am nothing. I'm just an ordinary man with no wisdom any higher than anybody else. It's God who is the revealer of secrets. Yes, your wise men, they are nothing, useless, and I'm like one of them. I am useless. I don't know these things, but I know the one who does. And that's the point. Nebuchadnezzar, the men of this world can't help you, but verse 28 says, there is a God in heaven. And Nebuchadnezzar, that God who is in heaven, sits on his throne and he rules over you as a king. You see, Daniel unashamedly acknowledged in the presence of the king that God is the sovereign. Remember, it's in the midst of a crisis. And even as he stands before the most powerful man in the world who could chop off his head at any moment, Daniel maintained his confidence in a God who was in control. He's ordained your days, Nebuchadnezzar. We won't get into the dream this morning, and in the interpretation of it, you read it yourself. It's about the future of his kingdom and all the others that would follow. Your days are numbered. Your kingdom is numbered. And so is the next one and the next one, until finally one comes that will have no end. The kingdom of Christ. But Nebuchadnezzar, your days are numbered. You will not sit on your throne forever, but there is a God in heaven who sits on his throne forever. And friends, ultimately, this is the reason why Daniel was so courageous in his crisis. This is the reason. Because there is a God in heaven. That's the reason. It's not about strength within, as we sang before in that song of standing up. It's not in the arm of flesh. The strength comes from the one who is sovereign. Daniel knew that God, the sovereign one who reigned in heaven, he knew that that was the one who works all things together for good to those who love him and who are called according to his purpose. Daniel loved him. And Daniel was one of those called ones before this sovereign God. Daniel believed in a sovereign God. Yes, he could tick the box on his little theology course, but it was more than just up here. Daniel trusted in a sovereign God, and that was evident in united prayer. Daniel lived his life knowing that there is a God in heaven. That's why he couldn't compromise, as we saw in chapter 1. And we see today in chapter 2 that Daniel lived his life knowing that there is a God in heaven, and Daniel knew that his God was not some sort of God that was hamstrung, that couldn't do anything because man is corrupt and that he has all this power. No, God is God, and that means he is sovereign. And therefore, Daniel could be courageous in the face of a crisis. And friends, there's the key for us living today. In the face of a crisis, don't turn to the men of this world. Turn to the God of heaven. Believe in the sovereign ruler of Israel and of the universe, and like Daniel, the son of Israel, trust in the God of heaven. And live like Daniel, knowing the God in heaven. So that when people look at your lives, they might even conclude, oh, there is a God in heaven. Look at the way he or she handled that situation. Now, for some of you this morning, your crisis is that you are under God's condemnation. You are a horrible crisis. Don't trust in yourself. Don't put your hope and your confidence in what you can do in your religion. Put no confidence in man. But do like Daniel, cry out in confidence to the God of heaven, because he is not only the sovereign God, he is a God who loves and forgives. For all who call out to him in faith, he will hear that prayer and answer them, and he'll save you. And when we, who are the people of God, stare our next crisis in the face, may we not be like the washing machine. Many of you ladies stand in front of a day or every other day. May none of us be like that. When a crisis comes, it throws us into the spin cycle. But rather, Not like an agitated Nebuchadnezzar. Our spirits all troubled that we suffer with sleep deprivation. No, not like that. May our friends, our true friends, and ask them to pray with us and for us. And may we ourselves turn to the one who is the sovereign God of that crisis, ever remembering that there is a God in heaven. May the Lord be pleased to give us the grace that we need if we would ever be people like Daniel. Amen.